In the spring of 1543, 17 fishermen departed from the coastal village of Volendam on the Zuiderzee to investigate reports of damaged nets and missing catches. For returned, the official church records of the Archdiocese of Utrecht, preserved in the Rijksarchief, document what they called Het Gevecht met het Demon, the battle with the demon. The testimony of the survivors, recorded separately by 3 different sources within days of the event, describes an encounter with something that challenged every assumption about what lived in those cold northern waters. The Zuiderzee in those years was not the peaceful lake it would become centuries later. It was a violent bay of the North Sea, cutting deep into the heart of Holland, its waters reaching nearly 40 miles inland at high tide. The bay was shallow, averaging only 12 to 15 feet in most areas, but treacherous. Sandbanks shifted with every storm. Currents moved in patterns that changed with the seasons. The water itself was murky, stained brown with sediment from the Isel River, visibility rarely extending beyond an arm's length below the surface. Yet these waters were rich. Herring, cod, eel, and flounder filled the nets of fishermen who had worked these grounds for generations. The villages that ringed the bay, Volendam, Marken, Monnikendam, Edam, existed solely because of this abundance. The sea fed them. The sea clothed them. The sea was everything. April of 1543 arrived unusually warm. The ice that typically locked the shallower parts of the bay until late in the month had melted by the first week. Fishermen saw this as a blessing, a chance to begin the season early and build reserves before the lean summer months when herring migrated to deeper waters. By the middle of the month, nearly every boat in Volendam was working daily runs, and many had begun night fishing again, a practice usually reserved for the height of summer when the fish rose to cooler surface waters after dark. The first sign that something was wrong came on April 14th. Martin Peters, a fisherman from Edam, found his nets destroyed, not torn by fish or snagged on rocks, but systematically shredded, as if something had methodically worked its way along each section, ripping the hemp to pieces. He discovered the nets floating in a tangled mass about 3 miles from shore, in an area he had fished successfully the day before. The wood floats that held the top of the net at the surface were cracked and splintered. Several were missing entirely. The lead weights on the bottom line had been torn free, the rope showing signs of massive strain, fibers separated and stretched beyond normal limits of tension. Peters attributed the damage to a seal. Large gray seals occasionally ventured into the Zuiderzee from the open ocean, and a big male could wreak havoc on fishing equipment. He replaced the nets at considerable expense and returned to his usual grounds. 2 days later, another fisherman, Claes Dirks from Monnikendam, reported similar damage. Then another. Within a week, 5 separate crews had lost nets in the same general area, a stretch of water locally known as the Diepwater, one of the few places in the southern Zuiderzee where depth exceeded 20 feet. The loss of equipment was serious. Hemp nets represented weeks of labor and significant material cost. Families could be ruined by the loss of multiple nets in a season. But more concerning was the fish. Catches throughout the affected area had dropped dramatically. Boats that had pulled in 50 or 60 pounds of herring per night were now returning with 10 or 15. The fish had either moved to other grounds or something was driving them away. On April 19th, the skippers of Volendam held a meeting in the Common House, a timber structure near the harbor where village business was conducted. 23 men attended, representing most of the fishing boats operating from the village. Dirk Cornelissen, the eldest skipper at 67 years, presided. The discussion centered on whether to avoid the Diepwater entirely or to investigate the problem directly. Opinion was divided. Some argued for avoidance. The sea was large enough that they could fish elsewhere and accept smaller catches until whatever was happening resolved itself. Others, particularly younger fishermen with families to feed and debts to pay, wanted to find the source of the problem and eliminate it. A compromise was reached. A group would go to the Diepwater not to fish but to observe. They would take 3 boats, more than enough men and vessels to handle any seal or shark that might be causing trouble. They would carry weapons, harpoons, gaffs, heavy clubs, and if they found an animal causing damage, they would kill it. The expedition was scheduled for April 21st, 2 days hence, giving men time to prepare equipment and arrange for others to cover their normal fishing duties. 16 men volunteered. By the departure date, 17 were committed to the expedition. The additional man was Peter Jansoon, a former soldier who had served in the Habsburg armies during the Italian campaigns and had returned to Volendam 3 years earlier to take over his deceased father's fishing boat. Jansoon was 41, literate, and known for his practical approach to problems. He had suggested that someone in the group should keep a written account of what they found, and since he was one of perhaps 3 men in the village who could write with facility, he appointed himself chronicler. It is Jansoon's account, written in cramped Dutch script on 6 sheets of paper and later copied into the church registry by Father Willemertz, that provides the most detailed description of what happened. The original pages survived until 1834, when they were lost in a fire that destroyed part of the Utrecht archives. But multiple copies have been made over the centuries, and the text remains consistent across all versions. The 3 boats departed Volendam harbor at dawn on April 21st. The vessels were typical bowyers, flat-bottomed fishing boats about 9 meters in length with a single mast and 4 pairs of oars. Each boat carried provisions for a day at sea: bread, cheese, dried herring, small beer, and wooden casks. The weather was clear, wind light from the southwest, seas calm. Ideal conditions. The journey to the Diepwater took approximately 2 hours of sailing and rowing. The boats traveled in loose formation, staying within hailing distance of each other. The men were in good spirits, according to Jansoon's account. Several joked about the sea monster they would certainly find, betting on whether it would turn out to be an exceptionally large seal or merely a school of aggressive pike. The consensus seemed to be that they would find nothing unusual, that the net damage had been caused by a combination of poor equipment maintenance and bad luck, and that they would spend an uneventful day on the water before returning with nothing to show for their efforts. They reached the Diepwater around mid-morning. The area was marked by a distinctive configuration of distant landmarks. A church steeple in Edam visible to the east, a line of windmills on the western shore, and a slight discoloration in the water where the bottom dropped away more steeply. The boats formed a triangle, roughly 200 feet separating each vessel, and began a systematic search pattern. Men scanned the water for any signs of disturbance, floating debris, unusual ripples, diving birds acting strangely. For the first hour, they found nothing. The water was murky, as always, revealing little beneath the surface. A few fish jumped, herring fleeing from something below, a common sight. Seagulls circled overhead, their harsh cries the only sound besides the splash of oars and the creak of timber. Then, shortly before noon, the crew of the northernmost boat spotted something floating. It was a piece of wood, a section of boat hull roughly 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. The wood was oak, thick and sturdy, the type used for the structural ribs of a good fishing boat. But it had been split, not cleanly like a carpenter's cut, but torn, the grains separated with ragged edges and long splinters protruding from both sides. More concerning was the manner of the damage. The wood had been bent beyond its natural flexibility, stressed until the fibers separated. The force required to do this to seasoned oak was enormous, far beyond what any normal sea animal could produce. The boats converged on the find. Men pulled the wood aboard, examining it closely. There were marks on the surface, not scratches but indentations, circular depressions about 2 inches in diameter pressed deep into the wood. The pattern repeated along one edge, 7 distinct impressions in a rough line. One of the older fishermen, Arent Claesson, suggested they looked like the marks left by a tentacle, similar to what he had seen once on a piece of driftwood that a fisherman claimed came from a ship attacked by a giant squid off the coast of Portugal. But squid were creatures of the deep ocean, not shallow bays. And the marks were wrong. Too large, too deep, and the pattern irregular, not the neat symmetrical arrangement of a squid suckers. They found more debris, another section of hull, this one with part of rope still attached. The rope had not been cut or worn through. It had been pulled apart, individual strands separated by force. A piece of sail canvas torn into strips. A wooden bucket crushed flat as if stepped on by something massive. And, most disturbingly, a boot. The leather was salt-stained and waterlogged, but intact. The foot was still inside. The boot was recognizable. It had been made by Yost the shoemaker in Edom, distinctive for the peculiar way he stitched the sole. The foot inside was identified by its size and a deformed small toe, a birth defect. The boot had belonged to Hendrik Jacobs, one of 3 fishermen from Edom who had gone out 4 days earlier and not returned. Their boat had been listed as lost, presumed sunk in a sudden squall, though no bad weather had been reported. The mood among the expedition changed. What had begun as a hunt for a nuisance animal was now clearly something more serious. 3 men were dead, their boat destroyed by something with enough strength to tear oak planking and snap rope. The question was what, and whether it was still in the area. Dirk Cornelissen made the decision to continue the search. They had weapons, they had numbers, and they needed to know what they were dealing with. The men agreed, though Janssen noted in his account that the agreement was not unanimous and that several wanted to return immediately. But the social pressure to show courage, to not be the one who advocated retreat, kept objections muted. The boats spread out again, this time searching for the creature itself rather than debris. They moved slowly, or as barely breaking the surface, try to make as little noise as possible. Men hung over the sides, staring into the murky water, looking for any sign of movement below. The sun was high now, and though the water was opaque, occasionally a shadow would pass underneath, visible as a darker patch against the brown background. Fish, probably, or perhaps something else. It was Peter Janssen, in the lead boat, who first noticed the birds, or rather, the absence of them. Seagulls had been circling constantly since they arrived, but now, as his boat moved forward, the birds stopped following. They hung back, wheeling in the air about 100 feet behind the stern, calling to each other but refusing to come closer. He pointed this out to the skipper, Cornelissen, who nodded grimly. Birds sense things humans couldn't. If they were avoiding an area, there was reason. The water ahead looked no different from the water behind. Same murky brown color, same small wavelets disturbing the surface. But as the boat moved forward, the smell began to reach them. It was faint at first, just a hint mixed with the normal sea odor of salt and fish and rotting weed. But it grew stronger, a sweet, sickly smell like meat left too long in the sun, but with an undertone of something chemical, almost medicinal, that made the nostrils burn and the stomach turn. The men recognized the smell of death. But death in water usually meant rotting fish or seaweed, a natural part of the sea's cycle. This was different, more intense, more wrong. Cornelissen ordered the boat to stop. The oars lifted, dripping, and the vessel coasted to a halt. The other 2 boats pulled alongside, their crews asking what was wrong. The smell reached them moments later, and the questions stopped. They all smelled it. They all knew something dead and large was nearby. A brief discussion followed. Some wanted to leave immediately. Others argued for finding the source. If it was a dead whale or a large shark, they should know, both to report it to authorities and to understand if decomposing carcasses were what had been damaging the nets and driving away fish. A dead whale could leak oils and fluids that would foul fishing grounds for weeks. They decided to investigate quickly and then retreat. The boats moved forward in line, staying close to each other. The smell grew stronger with each stroke of the oars, becoming almost unbearable. Men wrapped cloth around their faces, breathing through the fabric to filter the stench. Some gagged. One young fisherman, Martin Willems, vomited over the side, heaving until nothing came up but bile. The water began to change color. The murky brown took on a grayish tinge, then darker patches appeared, floating just below the surface. At first they looked like seaweed or debris, but as the boats drew closer, it became clear the patches were something else. They were organic, shapeless masses of tissue suspended in the water, slowly drifting with the current. The largest was perhaps 3 feet across, a blob of gray-green matter with no defined edges, dissolving into the surrounding water like ink in a glass. One of the men reached down with a gaff and hooked one of the smaller pieces, lifting it onto the deck. It landed with a wet slap, immediately beginning to spread out, losing cohesion. The substance was not solid flesh, but not liquid either, somewhere between a colloidal mass that flowed slowly like thick oil. The smell that came off, it was overpowering. Men turned away, eyes watering. The mass on the deck began to steam slightly, releasing vapor, and where it touched the wood, the planking darkened and began to pit, as if being eaten away by acid. Cornelissen ordered it thrown overboard immediately. Someone kicked it with a boot, and the leather hissed on contact, the surface scarring. They used the gaff to push the mass back into the water, where it sank slowly, trailing tendrils of dissolving tissue. Whatever this was, it was not a normal animal carcass. The tissue was wrong. The smell was wrong. The effect on wood and leather was absolutely wrong. The consensus began to form that they should leave, that this was beyond their understanding and their equipment, that whatever had died here was something unnatural that should be reported to authorities with more resources and knowledge. But as Cornelissen turned to give the order to withdraw, the water beside the boat erupted. Jansson's account describes the moment in clinical detail, his soldiers' training evident in the precise observation even amid chaos. Something rose from the water approximately 5 feet from the starboard side of Cornelissen's boat. It came up fast, breaching the surface with explosive force, sending up a sheet of water that drenched the men nearest the side. The thing was massive. Jansson estimated the visible portion at 8 to 10 feet in length and perhaps 4 feet in width, though the boundaries were unclear because the form kept changing, shifting, parts extending and retracting. The color was grayish-green, mottled with darker patches, and what looked like open sores or lesions that wept the same viscous fluid they had found floating in the water. The surface was not scaled or furred but slick, covered in a thick mucus that dripped continuously. Protruding from the central mass were appendages, not arms or tentacles in any conventional sense, but extensions of the body itself, hollow tubes of flesh that moved with muscular contractions, expanding and contracting like the throat of a frog. There were at least 6 of these appendages visible, each perhaps 2 or 3 feet long, and at the end of each was an opening, a circular mouth lined with inward-pointing barbs or teeth, small and sharp and numerous. But what froze the men in place, what Jansson emphasizes in his account, were the eyes. The creature had eyes scattered across its visible surface, not arranged in any pattern but distributed randomly, and they were not all the same. Some were small, black, and simple like fish eyes. Others were larger, with pupils and irises that looked disturbingly mammalian. They did not all face the same direction. They did not blink in unison. Each seemed to operate independently, scanning different areas, and the cumulative effect of all these eyes looking in all directions at once was profoundly disturbing on a level beyond rational fear. The creature made a sound. Jansson describes it as something between a hiss and a gurgle, a wet, bubbling noise that seemed to come from multiple openings simultaneously. The sound resonated not just in the ears, but in the chest, a subsonic component that could be felt as much as heard. For perhaps 3 seconds, the creature and the men simply stared at each other. Then, one of the appendages moved. It lashed out toward the boat, extending with shocking speed, the mouth opening at its end dilating. The appendage struck the gunwale, missing a fisherman named Garrett Peters by inches. Where it hit, the wood hissed and began to smoke. The mucus on the creature's flesh was caustic. The paralysis broke. Men shouted, grabbed weapons, scrambled away from the side. Cornelissen, to his credit, remained standing and began issuing orders. He called for the harpoons, for men to arm themselves, for the other boats to close in and provide support. The creature sank back below the surface. For a moment, the water was still, showing only the ripples from its descent. It hit the boat from below. The impact was tremendous. The entire vessel lifted a foot out of the water and came down crooked, taking on water over the lowered side. Men fell. 1. Joost Willems went overboard into the water. He surfaced immediately, sputtering, swimming back toward the boat. Hands reached down to pull him up. He grasped the extended arms, his body half out of the water, when something below grabbed his legs. He screamed. The men holding him tried to pull, but the force dragging him down was immense. His eyes went wide with shock and pain. He screamed again, a sound that cut off abruptly as he was yanked downward with such force that he tore free from the men holding him. His body disappeared beneath the surface. The water closed over him. A moment later, the water turned dark with blood, a spreading cloud that rose from the depths in pulsing bursts. The 2 other boats had closed in. Men threw harpoons into the water where Joost had disappeared. Several struck something solid. The lines went taut. The creature surfaced again, this time between all 3 boats, a thrashing mass of tissue with 2 harpoons embedded in its body. The weapons seemed to cause it no significant distress. It pulled against the lines, dragging the boats closer together, threatening to entangle them. Peter Janszoon, drawing on his military experience, shouted for men to cut the harpoon lines before the boats were pulled under or collided. Axes bit through rope. The lines parted. The creature, freed from restraint, turned its attention to the nearest boat, the one skippered by Erik Claes from the southern end of Volendam. What followed was methodical destruction. The creature did not attack in a frenzy. It worked with apparent intelligence, using its appendages to grasp the boat's gunwale and pull itself partially out of the water, leveraging its weight against the vessel. The small boat, designed for calm water fishing, could not withstand the strain. The side caved in with a splintering crash. Water poured in. Men abandoned ship, jumping into the water and swimming desperately toward the other 2 boats. The creature released the sinking boat and moved toward the swimmers. It was fast in the water, far faster than a man could swim. It reached the nearest swimmer, Laurens Jans, and simply enveloped him. The appendages wrapped around his body, pulling him against the central mass. He struggled, beating at the creature with his fists, but his hands only sank into the gelatinous flesh. The mouths on the appendages attached to him. His screaming took on a different quality, higher, more desperate. Then he was pulled under. The men in the 2 remaining boats had seen enough. Cornelissen shouted to retreat. Oars hit the water, men rowing with desperate strength. The boats pulled away, leaving behind the sinking vessel, the swimmers still in the water, and the creature. But not all the swimmers were abandoned by choice. 2 men made it to the boats and were pulled aboard. A third, Claes Peters, reached the side of Janszoon's boat and grasped the gunwale. But as hands reached down to pull him up, the creature surfaced directly beneath him. It did not grab him. It simply rose, lifting him out of the water on its back. For a surreal moment, Claes Peters lay sprawled on top of the creature, sliding on the mucus-covered surface. Then the creature rolled, like a whale breaching, and Claes slipped off and into the water on the far side. He did not resurface. The boats rowed. The creature followed for perhaps 200 yards, keeping pace easily, its form visible just below the surface as a dark shadow. Then, inexplicably, it stopped. It surfaced one final time, the mass of its body breaking the water, eyes staring in all directions. The wet, gurgling hiss echoed across the water. Then it sank and did not reappear. The 2 boats did not stop rowing until they reached Volendam harbor. Of the 17 men who had departed that morning, 13 returned. 4 were dead: Joost Willems, Laurens Jans, Claes Peters, and Erik Claes, the skipper whose boat had been sunk. In addition to the dead, 2 of the returning men were injured. One had been splashed by the creature's mucus and had severe burns on his hands and forearm, the skin red and blistered, weeping clear fluid. The other had been struck by one of the appendages during the attack and had a circular wound on his shoulder, a ring of small punctures that had already become infected, the flesh around them swollen and discolored. The survivors reported immediately to Father Willem Aerts, the parish priest, who also served as the informal authority figure in the village in the absence of any local nobility or government officials. Jansun presented his written account. The other survivors corroborated the details. The priest listened, asked clarifying questions, and recorded everything in the church register. Father Willem's response was immediate and practical. He ordered that no fishing boats were to leave harbor until further notice. He sent messengers to the surrounding villages, Marken, Monachindum, Edom, Purmerend, warning them of the danger and advising cessation of all fishing activities in the southern Zuiderzee. He wrote a detailed letter to the Bishop of Utrecht, describing the events and requesting guidance and assistance. He also organized a religious response. The next day, April 22nd, he led the entire village in a procession to the harbor, where he conducted a blessing of the waters, prayers for the dead, and intercessions asking for divine protection against the creature. The Latin prayers and Dutch hymns echoed across the empty harbor, the fishing boats bobbing at anchor, their sails furled. News spread quickly. Within 3 days, the story had reached Amsterdam, where it was discussed in the town council. Within a week, it had reached The Hague and the court of Regent Mary of Hungary, who governed the Habsburg Netherlands on behalf of her nephew, Emperor Charles V. The response from authorities was skepticism mixed with concern. Sea monsters were a staple of sailors' tales, usually dismissed as exaggeration or misidentification. But the deaths were real. The destroyed boat was real. The consistency of the witness accounts was compelling. An official investigation was ordered. A commission consisting of 2 representatives from the Admiralty of the Northern Quarter, a scholar from the University of Leuven who specialized in natural philosophy, and a military officer with experience in coastal defense traveled to Volendam on May 2nd. They interviewed the survivors separately, comparing accounts for inconsistencies. They examined the injured men. They inspected the piece of destroyed hull that had been recovered. They measured the depth of the indentations in the wood and calculated the force required to produce them. Their report, filed on May 8th and preserved in the archives of the Admiralty in Hoorn, concluded that the survivors were telling the truth as they understood it. The commission acknowledged that the men had encountered something unusual and dangerous. However, the report stopped short of confirming the existence of an unknown species of sea creature. Instead, it suggested several possibilities. An aggressive grouping of large eels, which were known to inhabit the Zuiderzee, a deformed whale or shark suffering from disease that had altered its appearance. Or, most cautiously, a creature of unknown origin whose nature cannot be determined from the available evidence. The commission recommended a military expedition to the Diepwater to locate and kill the creature if possible, or at least to determine whether it still posed a threat to shipping and fishing. The expedition was authorized on May 10th. A squadron of 3 naval vessels, each carrying 20 armed men and equipped with artillery, set out from Hoorn on May 12th. They searched the Diepwater for 4 days. They found no sign of the creature. What they did find were the remains of 2 more fishing boats, both from Edom, wrecked and scattered across a wide area. The wreckage was consistent with the damage described by the Volendam survivors, wood torn rather than broken, ropes snapped under tension, and that same pattern of circular indentations on some of the planks. But the creature itself did not appear. On the 4th day, the squadron found something else. Floating on the surface, near the deepest part of the Diepwater, was a mass of decomposing tissue, similar to what the Volendam survivors had described. The naval crews approached cautiously and recovered several samples using long poles, careful not to touch the material directly. The samples were stored in sealed wooden casks and transported back to Hoorn for examination. The scholar from Leuven, Adriaan van der Molen, conducted a detailed analysis of the tissue samples. His report, written in scholarly Latin and later translated into Dutch, described the material as flesh of unknown origin, presenting characteristics inconsistent with any cataloged species. He noted the unusual cellular structure, the presence of what appeared to be both internal and external digestive mechanisms, and the highly acidic nature of the mucus coating. He speculated that the creature might be a form of invertebrate, related perhaps to jellyfish or squid, but vastly larger and more complex than any known specimen. His conclusion was cautious. Without a complete specimen for dissection, definitive classification is impossible. The tissue samples were preserved in alcohol and stored in the collections of the University of Leuven. They remained there for approximately 200 years. In 1744, a fire destroyed the section of the university's natural history collection where the samples were kept. All physical evidence of the Zuiderzee creature was lost, but the documentary evidence remained. Father Willem's church records, Jansson's first-hand account, the Admiralty report, the scholar's analysis. Over the following decades, other incidents were recorded that bore similarities to the April 1543 attack. In 1547, fishermen from Marken reported an attack on their boat by a demon with many mouths. In 1558, a merchant vessel sailing across the Zuiderzee at night reported hitting something in the water that badly damaged the hull and required emergency beaching for repairs. The crew described seeing something large and pale moving away from the ship in the darkness. In 1602, during the construction of new harbor facilities at Enkhuizen, workers dredging the sea bottom brought up bones that did not match any known animal. The bones were large, porous, and strangely shaped, described in the builder's records as not fish, not whale, but something other. The bones were examined by local physicians and declared monstrous. Their current location is unknown. The pattern of incidents tapered off after 1620. Occasional reports surfaced, a destroyed net here, a strange sighting there, but nothing on the scale of the 1543 attacks. Whether the creature died, left the area, or simply became more reclusive is unknown. The survivors of the April 21st expedition lived out their lives in various ways. Dirk Cornelissen, the skipper, retired from fishing and became a net maker, working on shore until his death in 1557 at age 73. Peter Janszoon continued fishing for another 10 years, but left the Zuiderzee entirely, moving to the coast of Friesland, where he fished the Wadden Sea until his retirement. His written account remained in his family for generations before being donated to the church. Several of the other survivors also left fishing, taking up other trades or moving inland. The psychological impact of the encounter seems to have been profound and lasting. In the 20th century, the Zuiderzee ceased to exist as a saltwater bay. The Afsluitdijk, a massive dam completed in 1932, cut the Zuiderzee off from the North Sea, converting it to a freshwater lake renamed the IJsselmeer. The transformation was total. The ecology changed. The fish species changed. The salinity dropped to zero. Large sections of the former bay were reclaimed as polders, drained, and converted to agricultural land. The Diepwater, the site of the 1543 encounters, is now dry land, part of the Flevopolder, covered in wheat fields and small towns. Modern marine biologists, when presented with the historical accounts of the Zuiderzee creature, generally dismiss them as misidentifications or folklore. The descriptions, they argue, do not match any known species and contain elements that are biologically implausible. The combination of attributes, the shapelessness, the multiple eyes, the caustic mucus, the apparent intelligence, suggests a conflation of several different animals observed under conditions of poor visibility and extreme stress. But a few researchers have noted interesting parallels. In 2003, a team from Wageningen University conducted an analysis of historical Zuiderzee ecology as part of a larger study on environmental change. They documented the presence in the 16th century of several species that have since gone extinct or abandoned the area, including certain types of large jellyfish and cephalopods. One researcher, Dr. Helena Visser, published a paper suggesting that the creature described in 1543 might have been a specimen of Interoctopus magnificus, a giant soft-bodied cephalopod hypothesized to have existed in northern European waters during the medieval period but never confirmed. The theory is speculative and not widely accepted. In 2011, during construction of a wind farm in the IJsselmeer, workers dredging the lake bottom uncovered a scatter of unusually large bones embedded in sediment dated to the 16th century. The bones were analyzed by paleontologists at Leiden University. The structure was anomalous, showing characteristics of both vertebrate and invertebrate skeletons, which should be biologically impossible. The bones were too fragmentary for species identification. They remain in storage, cataloged as unidentified marine organism, circa 1500 to 1600 CE. The villages that once lined the Zuiderzee are still there, though much changed. Volendam is now a tourist destination, known for its preserved traditional architecture and its folk costume demonstrations for visitors. The fishing industry is a shadow of its former self, kept alive more for cultural heritage than economic necessity. In the harbor, modern steel boats bob beside a few preserved wooden vessels maintained as historical exhibits. In the Volendam church, the old registers are preserved under climate-controlled conditions. Tourists can view selected pages under glass, including the entry for April 1543, where Father Willem recorded the attack. The handwriting is cramped and faded, the ink turned brown with age, but the words are still legible. On this day came Peter Jansen and 12 others from the deep water, having lost 4 men to a demon of the sea. May God have mercy on their souls and protect us from such horrors. The story has become part of local folklore, told in simplified form to tourists, printed in local history books, featured on informational plaques. Most people who hear it assume it's a legend, a colorful tale from a more superstitious age. Some locals know better. The older fishermen, the ones whose families have lived in Volendam for generations, speak of the story differently. They don't tell it for entertainment. They tell it as a warning, a reminder that the sea, even when tamed and converted to a lake, was once something far stranger and more dangerous than modern people understand. On April 21st of each year, a small ceremony is held at the Volendam harbor. It's not an official event, not promoted to tourists, just something the community does. A priest says a prayer for the 4 men who died in 1543. Names are read: Joost Willems, Lorenz Jans, Claes Peters, Erik Claes. Flowers are thrown into the water. It takes about 10 minutes. Then everyone goes back to their daily lives, to the prosaic modern world of engines and electronics and scientific certainty. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is up and the water of the IJsselmeer moves in patterns that seem almost deliberate, the older residents look out at the lake and remember what it used to be. They remember that it was once connected to an ocean, to depths and darkness that humans have never fully explored. They remember that in 1543, 17 men went out to investigate something strange, and 4 of them never came back. History preserves what it can: documents, testimonies, physical evidence when it survives. But some events resist easy classification. Some encounters fall into the gaps between known and unknown, between documented and dismissed. The Zuiderzee demon is one of these. Too well documented to ignore entirely. Too strange to accept fully. Perhaps it was real. Perhaps it was a creature of a species now extinct. A final specimen that lived and hunted in the Zuiderzee for a few brief years before death or migration removed it from human experience. Perhaps it was something else. A misunderstanding, a shared hallucination, a confluence of normal events interpreted through the lens of fear and superstition. The evidence does not conclusively support either interpretation. And perhaps that ambiguity is appropriate. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, to stand as reminders that human knowledge, for all its impressive expansion over centuries, still has limits. The men who survived that April day in 1543 knew what they saw. They carried the memory of it for the rest of their lives, etched into their minds with the clarity that comes from pure terror. When they closed their eyes, they saw those scattered eyes staring back from impossible angles. They heard that wet, gurgling hiss. They smelled that sickly, sweet chemical rot. These were not fading memories. These were scars. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps we don't need definitive proof or scientific classification. Perhaps what matters is that these men experienced something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of the world, and they did what humans have always done when facing the inexplicable. They survived, they remembered, and they warned others. The Zuiderzee is gone now, transformed beyond recognition. But the stories remain, passed down through generations, written in old registers preserved in archives. These stories are humanity's memory, our collective record of encounters with the unknown. They're not just entertainment or historical curiosity. They're a testament to the courage of people who faced something terrifying and lived to tell about it, even when they knew their testimony would be doubted. So when you hear these stories, when you read these accounts, you're not just consuming content or learning history. You're connecting with something deeper, with the fundamental human experience of confronting the unknown. You're honoring the memory of people who paid a terrible price to bring back a warning. You're acknowledging that the world is larger, stranger, and more mysterious than our daily experiences suggest. These connections matter. These memories matter, not because they prove or disprove anything, but because they remind us of our place in a world we only partially understand. They keep us humble. They keep us cautious. They keep us wondering. The questions remain. The mysteries endure. And somewhere in the darkness, beyond the reach of our lights and our knowledge, perhaps there are still things that watch us with scattered eyes, things that move through depths we haven't mapped, things that occasionally, very rarely, cross paths with humans and leave behind only fragments of evidence and traumatized survivors. The Zuiderzee is gone, but the water remembers. The stories remember. And if you listen carefully on a quiet night by the shore of the IJsselmeer, you might hear an echo of that gurgling hiss, a reminder that the sea, even in its diminished modern form, was once home to something that defied explanation and terrified those who encountered it. For men died in those waters in April 1543. Their names are recorded. Their deaths are documented. What killed them remains, 500 years later, a question without a definitive answer. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some questions are meant to remain open, to remind us that for all our progress and all our knowledge, we are still small creatures in a very large world, and the depths still hold secrets we haven't uncovered. The demon of the Zuiderzee may be gone, but the memory lives on, preserved in faded ink and old testimony, in local traditions and scholarly debates, in the cautionary instincts of people who live near water and understand, on some deep ancestral level, that the surface we see is not all that exists beneath.